Hello everyone, this is Gilgamesh. And in this video, I want to give you an overview of the history of the Hebrew language, particularly how it developed over the biblical period. The development of the Hebrew language, particularly as it's reflected in the Hebrew Bible and related texts, can be divided into several distinct historical strata. There isn't always agreement on classification, but linguistic analysis allows for the identification of major phases, often referred to as chronolects, which provide insights into the dating and composition of biblical texts. Biblical Hebrew is generally divided into three principal historical strata, and this is widely accepted among linguists. Number one is Archaic Biblical Hebrew. This is the earliest stratum and is primarily documented in the poetic parts of the Pentateuch and the early prophets, such as the Song of the Sea in Exodus 15, the Song of Devorah in Judges 5, Genesis 49, the blessing of Jacob, part of the story of Balaam in Numbers 23 and 24, and the address of Moses in Deuteronomy 32 through 33. These are all reliably identified as Archaic Hebrew. Some would also place specific hymns from the book of Psalms into this classification. While there's quite a bit less agreement on this, Psalms 2, 18, 21, 29, 45, 72, and 110 are often cited as the most likely psalms to preserve at least some aspects of this early Archaic Hebrew. Archaic Hebrew is characterized by a high concentration of rare words and grammatical constructions, often using verbal forms and case endings that fell out of use in later Hebrew. Its language is often compared to the texts from Ugarit in Syria, dating to the mid-2nd millennium BCE. Generally, texts of this type were thought to be composed in the 10th or even 11th century BCE. Number two is Standard or Classical Biblical Hebrew. Classical Hebrew is found in the prose section of the Pentateuch or Torah and the early prophets, Genesis through 2nd Kings, as well as in the classical prophecies of later prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hosea, Amos, and Micah. The language of almost all the Torah, and indeed most of the Bible, outside of a few archaic and late texts, largely belongs to Classical Hebrew. This is generally the Hebrew taught in the textbooks, and is sometimes taught in such a way that students get a false idea that the language is more static or uniform than it actually was. Classical Hebrew is closely related to contemporary Northwest Semitic languages like Moabite and Phoenician, as attested in the inscriptions from the monarchic period. Some have argued that it exhibits specific linguistic features that allow for chronological or geographic distinctions, such as differing usage of the short anoki and long ani forms of the first-person pronoun. However, there is little agreement and there is not much consensus on reconstructing how different regions, such as the northern kingdom of Israel, would have differed from the kingdom of Judah in its language. Because the surviving texts have largely been edited by speakers of Classical Hebrew, it is more difficult to determine if some texts may have been composed in other archaic or regional dialects before being transformed into their current state. Many of the texts likely existed in oral traditions before being committed to a written form and may have had significant variations in circulation. Linguists and philologists generally agree that Classical Hebrew can be assigned to the First Temple period, roughly from the 9th to the 6th centuries BCE. Third is late or post-classical Biblical Hebrew. Late Hebrew is primarily found in late compositions within the third section of the Hebrew Bible known as the Writings. This includes books such as Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, Chronicles, and Ecclesiastes. Late Biblical Hebrew displays significant differences from earlier works, not only in vocabulary, which includes borrowings from Persian and eventually Greek, but also in grammar and syntax. Certain verbal forms became less popular, and the variety of vocabulary became narrower. Some words evolved to have newer meanings. The 6th century BCE was marked by the Babylonian exile and is considered a significant turning point in biblical literature's linguistic history. As Israelites were removed from their homeland and placed into servitude, their native language became secondary to the languages of their captors. While they seem to have carefully preserved the older texts, Hebrew was a dying language, and new authors could not produce texts as linguistically complex as the previous generations. Some biblical books, such as Ezra and Daniel, have large sections that abandon the use of Hebrew altogether in favor of Aramaic, which was the common tongue that was starting to dominate ordinary speech. Late Hebrew is attributed to the Second Temple period, specifically the Persian and Hellenistic periods. The evolution of Hebrew continued beyond the biblical period, with a couple of distinct forms emerging. One of these is Qumran Hebrew. This would be the language of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls give us not only the oldest copies of biblical books that have been preserved, but also several original texts that were composed by the local community. They fundamentally changed some of our understanding of the nature of Hebrew during this Second Temple period. Previously, it was commonly thought that Hebrew had died by this point in history, but here we find a community that is not only preserving the older texts, but composing new ones in Hebrew. It is clear that the language had continued to evolve and was changing significantly, but it does still appear to be a spoken language during the first 2 centuries BCE through the 1st century CE. Number 2 in this post-biblical era is Mishnaic Hebrew. It is named after the Mishnah, which is the primary surviving work in this language. Mishnaic Hebrew is a written version of a vernacular language that may reflect the continuation of a separate Hebrew dialect strain. It is argued that it has some connections to earlier Northern Hebrew rather than a direct descent from the standard Jerusalem dialect of most of the Bible. Mishnaic Hebrew is a choppy, highly abbreviated language that struggles to express its ideas well. Quite likely, Hebrew was a dead language by the time of the composition of the Mishnah, meaning there were no longer native speakers who learned it as a primary means of communication. But it was a language of scholars and specialists interested in preserving a sense of tradition. The effort was followed by the writing of the Talmud in Aramaic, partly to clarify and expand the difficult-to-read Mishnah in a language more accessible to common people. Mishnaic Hebrew spans to the 5th century CE. At this point, Hebrew entered a middle phase where it operated as a dead language, much like Latin. Scholars would learn the language, and some minor documents were even composed in it, emulating grammatical forms of earlier stages of the language and occasionally innovating to express new concepts. But there were no native speakers, and there was little uniformity in its use. Literacy and being able to read Hebrew was limited primarily to Jewish scholars, and even there was quite rare until the Renaissance. Stepping into modern times, modern Hebrew is its own fascinating story. Starting in the 1880s, Eliezer ben Yehuda began a remarkable effort to revive the language. His son was raised speaking only Hebrew and was the first native speaker of the modern language. His first dictionary was published just after the turn of the 20th century. Today, about 10 million people are fluent in this language, and about 6 million of those learned it as their native language. It should be noted, however, that this is a significantly different language than ancient Hebrew. Only about 8,000 words of the 85,000 words in modern Hebrew originate from the ancient language, or about 10% of the vocabulary. The grammar has also been modified to be more familiar to Europeans, who were the primary adopters. The grammar and meaning of many ancient words remains unknown and disputed, and frequently ancient words have been given new meanings to match a modern context. Because modern Hebrew is a modern 20th century construction, despite any claims to the contrary, it does not give any special insight into the usage of the ancient language. Indeed, it can be difficult for modern speakers to separate modern cultural meanings associated with words from the ancient meanings the words held for the ancient authors. That is not to say that there are not great Israeli biblical scholars. There certainly are. But they achieved this status the same way as others, by studying the ancient texts and not through some unusual connection through speaking the modern language. In modern scholarship, Israelis form an important part of the community, but they do not dominate the field. Modern Hebrew is its own beautiful language with many great compositions in music, theater, film, and literature, and deserves to be studied and appreciated in its own right. But thinking it provides a special key to understanding the ancient texts is misguided. I hope you've appreciated this overview of the language, and I hope it inspires you to learn more. There are, of course, far more complexities than I can cover in a short video, and many areas of speculation and disagreement. I regularly make videos about the Hebrew language and the various texts that have come down to us in the Hebrew Bible. Please like and subscribe, and I hope you will join me in future videos.